And joining us now on The Debate, in our nation's capital, Carlo Dade, Executive Director at FOCAL, the Canadian Foundation for the Americas. And with us here in studio, Jehad Aliwewi, Executive Director with the Thorncliffe Neighbourhood Office in Toronto. Haida Mohesi, Professor in the Department of Equity Studies at York University. Atulya Sharman, Community Legal Worker at the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario. And Fei Tang, Host Program Manager at CultureLink. That's an organization that brings new and established Canadians together. Good of all of you to join us here in the studio. And Carlo, nice to have you on the line from Ottawa again. I want each of you tonight to start by speaking more personally. I've introduced all of you with your professional affiliations, but I want to start with the personal here. So Fei, to you first. You're born where?
In China.
Whereabouts?
Sichuan.
Came to Canada when?
In 2000.
So you've been here more than a decade. Does Canada yet feel like home for you?
It feels like home for me, of course.
When did it feel like home?
I'll tell you a story. 2005, that was my first time I went back to China. The moment I landed and I saw my parents and family members, they would say, "Oh, Fei, you really need to lose weight, you know." And you know, how you get so fat, they say. And I went to a store and buy clothes. And the moment I laid my hand on a pullover and the sales person came, "Oh, we don't have extra large." I said, Who you're talking to? I'm an M. And she said, "Oh, no, that won't fit you." I said, "Can I try it?" And she said, "Can you pay the deposit first?" Because she worried like the pullover gonna explode. So I came back. I said, "I feel so much like home here. I'm so normal now."
That is a great story. Okay, Jehad, you're born where?
I was born in Hebron, Palestine.
And came to Canada when?
About 22 years ago. So I lived almost half of my life in Hebron and the other half in Toronto. And I think I feel home when I started feeling home in Canada the moment I said, I don't think I'll go back forever.
And when was that?
To Palestine. That's a few years ago.
Just a few years ago?
Yeah, a few years ago. You know.
So you feel thoroughly Canadian now?
As much as I'm thoroughly Palestinian as well, but this is home.
This is home.
And this is where I have family, this is where I have love, this is where I have proof and profession. And I think that's what homes mean.
Understood. Carlo, how about you? Where are you from originally?
Grew up in Philadelphia, so from the States.
And Canada is home now, but when did it feel like home?
Wow, that's a great question. I've been here for about 8 years, and I don't think there was one turning point or one shining moment where it suddenly dawned on me that I was more Canadian than American. But it's a slow and gradual process. But after the first couple of years here, subtle changes. I'd always loved the cold, and so coming here and spending my first 2 winters here, I'm like, wow, I could spend some time in this place. Professionally, dealing with policy, foreign policy, I adapted to Canadian foreign policy and it became internalized very quickly. So little by little, these things built, and I think one day you just kind of realize at some point over the past couple of years, you've made the transition.
You didn't have an epiphany in a clothing store?
No.
Okay, just checking. Haida, how about you? You're from where originally?
I'm from Shiraz, Iran.
Iran. And came to
yes.
Canada when?
27 years ago.
Do you feel Canadian yet?
It depends what being Canadian means. But
that's a very complicated question.
Yes,
of course.
very, very complicated question. But like Carlo, I can't really name a turning point where when I felt that this is my home, and I lost the burning desire of going back to my country, even though I came here as a refugee, and it means basically involuntary entry to Canada. Nonetheless, I mean, I have my networks, and I think one important thing was feeling that my children are so established and they are so relatively happy here. So there is no going back home, and there is no home to be had. So
there's no going back home, and there's no home to be had.
Yes, at the moment, that's it.
Isn't that fascinating? Atulya, you're from where?
I'm from India, New Delhi.
From New Delhi?
Yes.
Came to Canada when?
In 2004 as a student.
So relatively recently?
Fairly recent as a permanent resident, only a year and a half now. 2009 I became a permanent resident.
Do you feel Canadian?
Not right now, not exactly at this point, but I feel there is a sense of physical sense of home that I do have. I just bought a house, so I do feel that sense of home. Mentally, still not there yet.
Do you feel Indian?
I do feel Indian.
So I don't know if you can put a percentage on it, but do you know?
I would still say it's still 90% Indian.
90% still?
Yes.
Okay, so you are still overwhelmingly back there as opposed to here,
That is correct.
emotionally.
Emotionally too.
But even with the building of the house.
At this point, yes. There are a lot of things based on that. I think things change. And it is very fluid at this point. I do, over the last year and a half, what has happened, initially when I used to go back to India, I would feel when the plane would land at Delhi airport that I am going home and I'm landing at home. Interestingly enough, last year and a half, I've been there 3 times. Now when the plane lands back in Toronto, I feel I'm coming home, which is interesting, contradictory, yet very fascinating. So I'm not sure what exactly. I think it's more of a mental state. I'm going through a very different process.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay, Carlo, how about you on this one? To have Canada truly feel like home, do you, when you came up here from the States, did you have to build a new identity for yourself up here?
No, I don't think it was building a new identity. There are certain things that attract you as an immigrant to a country. If you come as a refugee, perhaps it's a bit more, but if you come voluntarily, you make a choice. And there are things in the country to which you go that attract you. So it's building upon those. So for instance, the attraction to the cold weather, Canadian politics, the institutions in the country, the way it was built. There weren't so much a change as bringing out things that I had already been growing toward that were here and just accentuating those above other things.
Now, if you, Haida, came here as a refugee, did you feel you had to create a new identity for yourself here in Canada?
Oh, definitely, and I don't think actually it is limited, this sense of having multiple identities, having to create new identity is limited to people who came as refugees. I think, you know, at the era of globalization, identities are very fluid, they are unstable, they are multiple, and people constantly change identity. Some people acknowledge this and some don't, but the reality is that we have several identities, many identities. At some points in our life, one form of identity dominates other forms. How much we are aware of it, that's a different story. But yes, I think, you know, I'm no escaping from the fact that I feel differently in terms of my own identity compared to 27 years ago.
Shehad, let me follow up with you, because you're from one of those places in the world, Palestine, that's in the news every day, and almost always for the wrong reasons.
So I never miss home, actually.
So you read about it all the time. So how much does belonging in Canada depend on how people perceive you, how other people perceive you, as opposed to how you feel about being here?
Well, when we come to Canada, we come with luggages and baggages. So we bring in all kind of things with us, but also, so sometimes you're able to get rid of some of these luggages and baggages and throw them away, but sometimes you're not able to because people are constantly seeing you with those baggage. So I have been, as a person who has relatively a public role in the Palestinian community here and speaking on behalf of Palestine, so that has defined me. I have a very real connection with Palestine because my parents, my mom and dad, brothers and sisters, nieces and nephews are all still there, and I go almost every year, every second year to visit there. But I also have a very romantic notion of what Palestine is. And that romantic notion really developed in Canada, in Toronto. And that's part of maybe the success of an immigrant in feeling very comfortable with who you are, is that you're able to negotiate all these identity, multiple loyalties, if you will, very well, and trying to live with them. The problem becomes when you feel stuck in between two cultures rather than able to negotiate and allowed to belong equally to two cultures.
Now that's interesting. Let me follow up on that, because that romanticizing the homeland is a real, I mean, that is a very familiar thing for many people who are over here. But I wonder, Faye, whether you romanticize China.
Sometimes I do.
You do,
I think,
eh?
Yeah, the good food, the 5,000-year history and the culture. That's what I miss.
How about the authoritarian government and Tiananmen Square and all that? You know, because that's what a lot of Canadians think of when they think of China.
It's a complex question,
Indeed.
and then the history is complex. And I just recently watched the documentary Tiananmen Square, and I learned a lot from that. And I think I'm not missing that part. I feel more at home here than I was in Beijing. I'm less discriminated here than I was in Beijing. So,
Why would you have been discriminated against in Beijing?
oh, although I was a graduate from Peking University, it's a privileged status already, but because I was born in a province, not in Beijing, so I was forever called an outsider. And I taught in a college, and my performance review on that, it would load it, you should get rid of your province accent.
So you were part of the majority ethnicity in China, but more
I
discriminated against in China than here, where you're a visible minority.
I think so. I think so. I
That's
think
very interesting.
here, yeah, it's different.
Heidi, you wanted to add?
Yeah, I wanted actually to add to, going back to what Jihad said about identities are not always something, that's how I understand it, something that you choose. It is true that we choose our identities, but sometimes, particularly as immigrants, identities are imposed on you. Take the example of Muslims, general term Muslims. It is true that, for example, I have been born in a Muslim country, or predominantly Muslim country, although we have enormous numbers of, or we had, religious minorities. Regardless of how I identify myself, and I never identify myself with religion because I'm completely secular. When other people actually refer to me, they only reduce my identity to one aspect that they understand, and that is religion.
Is that unfair?
So, totally unfair, and I fight it, not because I have anything against people who are religious, but because my identity consists of many more dimensions.
Well, Carlo, let me go to you on this, because if there's one ethnic group in this country that gets discriminated against every single day, I'm being a little facetious here, but you know what I mean, Americans. You know, there's a great anti-American strain that goes through this country, and politicians get elected, running on that. You run into any of that?
Oh, from time to time, but as an American, you're used to it and you expect it. Having spent time abroad as an American and now time abroad as a Canadian, I can see the difference between the two, but it's humorous up here. But back to two earlier points, if I may. On being a minority in your country of origin, I'm actually African American. And I think that in terms of being an immigrant outside the country and feelings toward the United States, African Americans, for the most part, have a deeply ambivalent relation with the United States, given the history of the country. So going abroad and feeling ties back home, it's not the same as with other Americans. I wonder if this is true for minorities from other countries too. There's nostalgia for parts of back home, but you don't drink the Kool-Aid the way a lot of other people back home do about nationalism. And in terms of being Muslim, I also happen to be Muslim, and it's interesting that that's never really been an issue here in Canada. Indeed, for me, because I haven't changed my name and it's not well known, that element of the identity has never been problematic here. Whereas in the States, even though it's not as well known, it's more problematic. So it's interesting, though, those two aspects.
Indeed. I'm going to see if I can find out a little bit more about why our friend Atulya here only feels 10% Canadian and still 90% Indian. And I'm going to go on the hunch that you were a lawyer back in India.
That's true.
And several years on here in Canada, you've been here about 5 years right now, you are still working to get your credentials accepted here.
Yes.
How is that struggle going?
I think it's a bit of a system thing that's been going on. So I applied to get called to the bar in Ontario. So the way it works is you apply to the National Committee of Accreditation, and they look for your degree and then see what sort of experience you have, and then assign you a certain number of exams that you have to pass in order to get called to the bar. The only thing is the way the system is working, it's has a lot of discrepancy or discretion, I must say. And so I went to law school here, did a master's degree in law from University of Victoria, British Columbia,
Okay.
UVic Law School. And I have to write certain number of exams. I'm already more than halfway through it. And so I'll write 2 more exams and then hopefully write my bar exam in November. It's expensive, the process. So the way the barriers are happening or like being created is the process is long, cumbersome, and expensive. So if a person is landing, I was very fortunate. I came here as a student. I had the opportunity to make that decision whether to make Canada my home or not, or whether to even embark on that journey to make Canada or call Canada my home or not. For a lot of immigrants, that's not the luxury or a privilege that they have. They just land and then have to go through the rut and start making money, or at least support themselves if they're with the family.
But if I'm reading between the lines, it sounds as if you're saying the sluggishness with which I am working towards becoming a lawyer here in Canada is affecting my ability to feel truly Canadian.
That's true.
That is true.
Yeah, that's a fair reflection.
Okay.
And that's
yeah, go ahead, Carlo.
That's a major difference between the United States and Canada. Though Canada does much better on official integration policies or official welcome policies for immigrants, the United States does much better in actual integration through economics. The labor market is a lot more open, a lot more dynamic. You can land in the United States and get a job. You can work your way into the middle class. You can earn the means to affect your own integration, to affect your own ties back home. Whereas in Canada, it's a lot more difficult. So Canada's a lot better in terms of what it says. The United States is terrible in what it says, but much better in what it does.
Faye, can I get you on that? The economic integration and how easily or difficult it was for you on that score?
For me, because my husband found the job 1 month after landing, so it wasn't that difficult. But for most of our clients, which we see on a daily basis at CultureLink, it's a huge struggle for them to get employed. Some had to go through all these survival jobs in order to just make a living, and they got so exhausted they cannot even go to school to improve their English or get accreditation, because at the same time they have to still support their family. So it's a huge barrier for them. And whatever job they get, that's 4D jobs, difficult and demanding, dirty, dead end.
Dead end.
Yeah, dead end. And
Not
so
good.
Not good.
I want to follow up on something you said earlier, though, and that is when you went back to China and that funny experience you had of them seeing you as not Chinese anymore and somehow more Canadian. And
very nutritious, you know.
Jihad, let me go to you on this one, because you go back. You said you go back to the to Hebron, to the Palestinian territories where you're from. When you go back there, do they see a fellow Palestinian in you, or do they see a guy who seems thoroughly Canadian now?
Yeah, I think they do that. I think sometimes I be in a discussion with family coming to say hello, and a word of English slips in and say, oh, here goes the Canadian cousin that we have. So let's humor him. So I think sometimes you feel, when you're there, you feel like you really want to be there, and when you're here, you want to be there. So it becomes a challenge for people who come from places that are distinctly dissimilar. I mean, Hebron and Toronto could not be any more different. Mm-hmm. One is completely uniform in terms of the same people with the same last name. I used to joke with my friends, say diversity meant having classmates who don't have the same last name as I do. So, but here you come to a place in Toronto where there is completely different experiences. So it's interesting also, the same way that people here impose an identity on you, when you go there, you really are also boxed in place. Okay, he's the relative who's an outsider.
Now, Haida, because you left Iran as a refugee, have you been able to go back since you left?
No.
You have not been back?
No.
In how many years?
27 years.
And obviously, being Iranian is still a huge part of your identity.
Oh, very much so, and I'm very much involved in Iranian politics, and like every other, political refugee, I definitely want more justice and democracy for my country, but
does that
it's
hurt?
exactly because of that I can't go back, because I am on the other side of the fence as the present government of Iran.
I don't mean this to be too much of a touchy-feely question, but does the part of your identity that identifies still with back home, with Iran, Given the fact that you can't go back, does that
I
hurt?
wouldn't say back home, but very much Iranian.
Does it
you
hurt?
know.
That part of your personality?
Often, yes, often. But I would like to consider myself as a cosmopolitan person. So I'm very much, for example, attuned to what's happening in other parts of the Middle East, Palestine, for example, or Egypt. So that compensates a little bit. But I want to say something about integration, Steve. And it is true that economic conditions and the conditions of life, how well one is able to use his or her previous education and qualifications in this country are of enormous importance in terms of whether one can develop sense of belonging or not. But I can't reduce it only to that, because there are other factors involved in the sense of integration and a feeling of belonging. How well you are received by the society, respected as an individual, as a person, whether you are able to practice your own culture, religion, language, if you are religious, of course, without necessarily compromising the social values, social contract or not. These are all factors that are important in the sense of belonging.
Atulia, follow up on that if you would.
So it's very actually interesting that you point that out. The concept is so fluid, and it's so difficult to, it has so many layers within itself that the sense of belonging is like, and I just want to actually go back to the 90%, 10% dichotomy. I don't want to be boxed actually, because at times I don't feel Indian at all. And I don't want to be associated in those situations, because it depends on the situation where you are at. Sometimes I fully feel 100% Canadian. I'm rallying for Canada during the Olympics. I want them to be at the top of the table, everything. So it's not a physical process, I feel, when that happens, like, are you now feeling Canadian or not?
It's fluid.
It's fluid, but at this end, I think a lot of people have privilege, and I guess immigrants have privilege, and they have this, as you use the term, romanticized idea, what they have in their mind, and most of the times that romanticization comes from when you left the country. Your mind has stopped there. But now after 7 years, when I go back, it seems like I get reverse shocks there when I go to India after 7 years. The things have moved on. People have moved on. Things
You don't
have
recognize
shifted.
the place in some
it's
ways.
absolutely different.
Right. Faye.
Well, I wanted to make a clear distinction between being settled, feel settled, feel at home. Like I came to the studio and the producer said, I'll give you a few minutes to settle. But he would never say, make it your home, right? So I find settlement services like CultureLink or TNO, we do a lot of service to help immigrants settle, but integration is a two-way street. Really, we rely on the Canadian society, general public, to make the newcomers feel home, to really welcome them, and beyond welcome them, to go from to just tolerate their culture, tolerate their head carve or whatever.
To embracing it.
To embrace it, from to just accept whatever, little Italy, little Chinatown or whatever.
Understood.
Yeah, but to really adapt to their culture as well, to be friendly, from just simply be friendly, to become a friend of newcomers.
Understood. I want to go on a tangent from that to Carlo, because I think your work with FOCAL, you must deal with this all the time, and I'm talking here about remittances, which are the people, of course, who live here, but who send, in some cases, a considerable part of their paycheck back home in order to help their relatives back there, their family. It's a significant part of the GNP of a lot of those countries, particularly in Latin America. And I want to know, in your view, how that either simplifies or complicates the relationship that the people here have with back home.
Actually, it's funny that you mentioned this. Did extensive work on this, both with the U.S. government when I was in the States, the initial work, the beginning work, when the development community first discovered remittances, billions of dollars. There's states in Mexico that get $1 million a day from the United States. But the relationship is a lot more than just money, as we found when we began to work with these communities in the States and in Canada. its involvement in development projects back home, its involvement in politics back home. The relationship enabled by globalization, enabled by people being able to fly back and forth, by money being able to move back and forth, has really complicated situations on the ground back home with, say, development, which is a field in which we do a lot of work at Focal. The control of projects, the control of money, the control of politics nowadays too, is become a truly transnational phenomenon, a phenomenon that takes place in two places at the same time. One thing that we've observed, elections in the region, take the recent election in Haiti, every candidate running for president, and also a lot of the senatorial candidates, spent as much time campaigning in Miami, Boston, Montreal du Nord, as they did back home. You see this in Guatemala, Mexico. So it's not just the money. Money is the tip of the iceberg. It's a significant tip of the iceberg, but it's politics, it's culture. It's keeping culture alive back home. The nostalgia trade in goods and foodstuffs enables these products that are dying out or that don't have a viable market back home to have a viable market in communities that have the money to actually afford these products. Fascinating and complex relationship.
Jihad, you want to follow up on that? Because obviously the relationship between the Palestinian diaspora and back home, it's much deeper than just sending money back, isn't it?
Right, and increasingly many diaspora communities have become quite active in their countries of origin, social, economic, and political realities. And there is, I mean, the Tunisian community, for example, in Montreal, very small, but has been quite vocal in terms of what's happening in Tunisia and trying to make sure that the people who fled to Montreal from the old Tunisian regime are brought to justice. And the Tunisian community is fairly small and new, but they have been playing a very significant role, and that's important. The Palestinian diaspora is also very, very connected socially, economically, and again, romantically with the notion of Palestine. We don't only have parents who we send maybe a gift here and there to, but we also have a stake in terms of a social and economic and political reality and development and hopefully stability of that region.
Atulia, let me try this with you. I guess 50 years ago when you left the old homeland, you really left. I mean, it was, obviously before internet, before long-distance telephone rates were low, so that it was very simple to do, before Skype.
Yes.
It was hard to stay in touch with back home. How has technology affected the relationship between those who have, come here to start a new life and people back in the old homeland?
I think it's revolutionary. The change is, it's huge. Nowadays, I'm pretty much almost always connected with my family back home, with my brother, with my friends. And whenever I go back, like say once or twice a year, I see them and there's sometimes nothing new to talk because 15 hours ago we were talking over the phone or like on the internet. So, but the other thing that has happened, more and more real notion of settlement issues are also going back home too. How the policies, how the government has actively for a number of years, government has actively tried to serve Canada as an ideal dream location. And those notions when people land have been or they're either shattered or have experienced a lot of trouble getting into the system, faced a lot of systemic barriers. Those stories are also traveling back home. So the romantic idea of people back home is also they're getting into this awareness also, while it's not that easy.
Let me follow up with Faye on that because, of course, when you're emailing to friends or family back in China or recommending certain websites, the Chinese government is no doubt reading your emails and they're censoring those websites. So does technology help in your case?
Oh, I could talk freely with my friends, and it's more and more open in China, and you can put a lot of censorship on web, but still people call it the Great Wall, right, in China, but they have technique to overcome that walls, to see the world outside of China. And you go to the website blogging area, there's all kinds of very progressive ideas there. And sometimes that just amazed me.
Haida, can people with, you've heard this expression before, I'm not alleging it, but you've heard it before, divided loyalties. Can people with divided loyalties meet their obligations in both places, or is it too difficult?
I think so. No,
It can be done.
I think so. And you know, in the study that we conducted at York University for self-identified Muslims participated, and we administered 2,100 questionnaires in Toronto and Montreal among these 4 communities of Muslim origin: Palestinians, Iranians, Afghans, and Pakistanis. And it was amazing that despite the fact that very few relatively identified Canada as home, nonetheless, overwhelming majority were happy with the decision that they had made to come here. And so they go back and forth, not only in terms of physical going back and forth, but in terms of loyalties and sense of belonging to the country. And it was really quite a surprise to us that 70% of the respondents actually said that they would recommend coming to Canada to their to the communities back home. And perhaps Canada is doing something well, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that, you know, the multicultural policy that we are having here, the way it is being implemented and the way people understand it actually is on the right track, in my view.
There's always more to do, isn't there? There's always more to do.
Much more than that, Steve. Much more than that, because multiculturalism here creates some sort of false confidence or false comfort for the people, for the larger society, because they feel that, you know, they identify it with anti-racism, which is not true. And for some communities in the minority, also they want to create their own separate, private, self-contained communities. So obviously, you know, we need an overhaul for the multiculturalism policy.
So I just wanted to actually follow up on what Heather said. So it's my sense of home, like, because it's such a personalized concept for everyone. My sense of home would be when the policies are more equitable, people are easily able to access professions, services without any discrimination. I think there will be a better opportunity and more likelihood that people will feel at home easier. That's one of the things that we do see at the South Asian Legal Clinic. I deal with a lot of low-income South Asians across GTA, and that is something that the people are struggling with. And we see majority of people of color are experiencing that sense of not belonging because of a lot of systemic issues. And I think that is something a lot of people take a negative aspect away from it.
I want to follow up, Jihad, on this issue of divided loyalties. Everybody else on this program today was born in an internationally recognized country. You were not. Is this issue of divided loyalties even more complicated given the, you know,
It is. It's
given
actually,
Palestine's reality?
Right. I have been defined by being Palestinian in so many ways, but at the same time, when I was sworn in as a Canadian citizen, I was welcomed as a Jordanian. So my actual Palestinian identity have always been negated at all levels. I am.
Can I just understand that? Because Jordan was considered responsible for Palestine at the
That's
time?
right, and administratively, and no, there is no such thing as, although I am Palestinian and I'm recognized worldwide, and there is something called Palestinians, but on paper, at least when I came to Canada, I came on a Jordanian passport, and it says Jordanian. So in that sense, it's always been quite a struggle to really be clearly defined as a Palestinian. My loyalty is divided, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's clashing. I think it's divided in a very good proportions. Sometimes I'm happy with one part of my identity. Sometimes I'm not. It's like having two parents. You're happy with your father today. You're not happy with your mother, and vice versa. And I think we should think of our identities as sort of a form of parents that you don't often get along with them perfectly and equally.
Right. Carlo, we've got about a minute left, and I want to give it to you because I'm wondering whether we're seeing this emergence of a, fancy word here, deterritorialized notion of home. Home being more a state of mind as opposed to a real place. Is that part of your experience? Is that a part of the Canadian experience now?
I think, well, just let me say to a friend from Palestine, Orden Umudunya. So I can understand what happened with coming to Canada. But
translate for the rest of us, please.
It's an old Arab saying, say, Egypt is the mother of the world. In this case, Jordan is the mother of the world.
Okay. Okay.
Dematerialized places. Yeah, increasingly because of globalization, the technologies of globalization, and the ability to really, for the first time in history, literally exist in two places at the same time, the concept of place is becoming changed, perhaps a bit less relevant. We talked about technology a few minutes before. If you think about it, cell phones. When I first started working in Haiti, cell phones didn't exist. But today, any person in practically any village in the country, whether or not they're literate, which is a huge change, can communicate with the outside world, can take part in the outside world. People in Montreal can participate on a daily basis back in the lives of communities in Haiti. This is a global phenomenon. So the concept of space and time and place are being changed by technology.
Carlo, got to
with
jump in there.
travel.
That's the last word because we're out of time. Carlo Dade from
Okay.
FOCAL, thanks for being there on the line for us from Ottawa, Ontario, our capital city. Back here in the studio, Haida Mohesi from York University, Fei Tung from CultureLink on one side of the table, Jehad Aliwewi, Thorncliffe Neighborhood Office, and Atulya Sharman from the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario on the other side. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate your participation tonight.